So before we get started, I do have a confession to make. I kind of misled Jordan on my application. I do love developer days, and it's really a great experience. But I'm not actually a developer, so I really want to be part of the excitement, and so I misrepresented my experience there on the application. So bear with me as we go. But today we're going to be discussing developing custom APIs through the SailPoint Identity IQ plugin interface. And so my name is Adam Creaney. I'm a Director of Technology Alliances here at SailPoint, and most of my job is working with independent software vendors that want to integrate with SailPoint and discussing what those use cases might look like. And really, that's the best part of my job. The worst part of my job is when I have to decline a partnership because there's no feasible way to build that technical integration. One of the ways that we get around this is with a product like Identity IQ. It's extremely flexible. And the plugin framework allows us to build custom APIs that then allow those external vendors to build integrations that might not have been possible using the out-of-the-box functionality. So why would you need a custom API? Well, if you know Identity IQ and you know the APIs available, it's really limited to that SCIM interface and a couple of legacy APIs that have been around for years. The SCIM interface is great. It follows the specification, but it is limited in the types of objects you can retrieve. So if you want to do anything outside of those, you're kind of stuck. One example that jumps to mind is audit events. There's no SCIM object representing audit events in Identity IQ, but those are very valuable to retrieve and get out into something like a SIM tool or a SOAR tool. So the other thing you can do, right, and not just extracting information, but also making changes. Say you have a external chat interface or iPad solution that you want to, automate some approvals or some certification sign-offs. You can use a plugin framework to do that as well. So when it comes to building an API, a RESTful API, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind when you're doing that. First and foremost, as with anything, you need to keep an eye on performance. I'll show an example here in a little bit where, I will provide a poorly coded example, which will cause an extreme delay in the response coming back from Identity IQ. You also want to be mindful of the fact that you're processing stuff inside of an IQ it should follow the same rules as if you're writing a standard Bean Shell rule, right? So looking at the Bean Shell performance guide, things like that on Compass is very valuable. The next consideration, equally as important, is security, right? You're allowing external services to interact with your identity governance solution. These could be write operations, read operations. You want to make sure that you're using the right type of authentication as well as the right authorization model for those endpoints. Thirdly, and not as important, but still important, are following standards, right? RESTful APIs tend to have certain standards they all follow, which gives the developer an expectation of how they should work and what their responses will look like. Fourth, error handling. There's nothing more frustrating than interacting with an API and getting 500 internal server error code back, but not understanding why you're getting that error. So we'll show a few of these in the examples here in a little bit. So first of all, performance. You want to make sure that your APIs are responding in a timely manner. Use case dependent. You might have this as part of a real-time operation that requires the API to be fast, and you don't want a user waiting on delay from your APIs. So first, along those lines, when you're writing your response, if it's retrieving information out of Identity IQ, make sure your responses are small. Make sure you're using things like pagination or filtering to make sure that you're not overwhelming Identity IQ trying to create these giant JSON response objects to then pass back to the client. I'll show the example again later with my syslog events. I have a very old environment that's been running forever. It's got 200,000 or so syslog events, and I'll show you what happens when you try and retrieve all of them in a single call. If you are retrieving stuff from the Identity IQ database, make sure that you're using projection queries, using those query options, using filters. Follow those best practices for performance management, and consider how you'll be using that endpoint. Is this an endpoint that's going to be called once a day? Is this something that's going to be called many hundreds of times an hour? Keep all that in mind when you're designing your APIs for performance. And last but not least, is a new API needed? If all you're doing is creating an API that creates a smaller response than our traditional, identity SCIM response, maybe explore that SCIM API a little bit more to understand how you can reduce the size of the attributes that are getting returned for each identity. That's just an example. If it's a one-time extract of data, simple advanced analytics CSV export might get you where you need to go without having to write a plugin API. Security. So the next big one that I mentioned was security. The security model for interfacing with APIs and Identity IQ, you can either use basic authentication or you can use OAuth authentication. My preference is for OAuth, but either way, whichever option you choose, the authorization model is based on the identity that you're authenticating with. So when it's basic authentication, the capabilities and SailPoint rights assigned to that identity are what's going to be authorizing the user to interact with your endpoints, and just like any other API endpoints within SailPoint. There's an example on the PowerPoint right now on how we would code that as an annotation in the actual REST class in your plugin. Basically, you specify which SP right is required to access either all of your endpoints or specific endpoints that you're going to create. Those are assigned through capabilities. The plugin framework itself has the ability to import XML objects. So inside of your plugin, you can create your own capabilities, your own SP rights, and bring those on into Identity IQ. The important part is you assign those, once they're in your Identity IQ instance, assign those to the user who you're going to be authenticating with. All right, standards. I'll briefly go over this, but there's some basic RESTful API principles you should follow when you're designing your APIs. The 5 major ones for any RESTful API are uniform interface, stateless, layered system, cacheability, and code on demand. If you are kind of falling into an area where the data you're retrieving could be wrapped in a standard or a specification, I would encourage you to do that. It makes any other external clients that might want to interface with your API understand beforehand what it is you're going to be returning to them. Common best practices, make sure you're accepting and responding in JSON. It's just easier. Make sure that your operations that you're using follow sort of those HTTP method verbs. So put, patch, delete, post, and get. So if you are modifying an object, make sure you use put or you use patch. That goes without saying. Nouns instead of verbs for your endpoints. I'm guilty of this all the time. When I create an endpoint, I just kind of name it whatever I want to, but typically you want to make sure you're naming it. If you're retrieving syslog events, for example, or audit events, for example, your endpoints should be something like /audit event or events. And again, going back to the performance as well, but a best practice is to include the capacity for filtering, for pagination, and just because, Identity IQ typically has very large data sets, so if you're going to be building an API to retrieve information, make sure you're doing that. And then keep them secure. We already touched on security. Finally, error handling. When you're building your APIs, each method should handle responses in a known way. So, your informational responses with an HTTP request are going to be 100s. Your 200s are successful responses. There's a whole breakdown. This is knowledge you can find on Google, like which error code should I be using or which response code should I be using. I'll show kind of how that's set up here in a plugin in a minute. Your 300s are your redirection messages. You really probably won't need to worry about those when you're building a plugin. 400 errors, that's where we want to spend most of our time. So 400 errors are when a client sends something over to your endpoint that might not be expected, or it's misformed, malformed. You want to make sure that you're responding with the appropriate server response. So things like Identity IQ will handle the authorization and the authentication for you, so you get 403 forbiddens will come back if you aren't authorized to hit the endpoints as specified in your class. And then server error responses, I mentioned earlier, there's nothing that frustrates me more than when I get a 500 back and I have no idea why. So be informational. You also want to be conscious of not sharing too much information in your error responses. Attackers may be fishing for figuring out if a user exists or not, and so if you have something like user doesn't exist, you're giving them a clue that user isn't there. If you just respond more generically, they can't kind of fish for those active or real users. And then logging I'm not going to spend too much time on, because if you've worked with Identity IQ before and writing Bean Shell, you'll know that Log4j2 logging is is important. It's just as important in your REST endpoints if you're trying to debug your service itself. All right, testing. So we'll go through. I'll kind of iterate through the process of how I test. But basically, you're gonna write your code in an IDE. It's gonna be associated with the basic SailPoint objects. So you're gonna get all the niceties of your IDE, checking to make sure you don't have any parsing errors. Once you're ready, you're gonna build your plugin. You're gonna install it into IdentityIQ, and then I use Postman. You can use curl. You can use anything you want to interact with those APIs. But I typically use Postman, and I'll just start firing things at my endpoints and see what the responses are and if it's expected or not. You can also, in Postman, you can build a mock server to sort of give you the expected response back, so you don't have to continually iterate through, while you're testing in Postman, iterating through the actual deployed plugin. All right. Got 15 minutes. Cool. All right. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not really a developer. I was asked very politely and nicely a couple years ago to stop writing code. And every time I do write code, my team gets upset with me. So we'll see how this goes. All right. So we should be able to see my screen now. And I've got a pre-built plugin here, just an example plugin with a couple methods created. So let's go over the layout real quick. We've got in our manifest, which is basically when you import your plugin into IdentityIQ, a plugin object gets installed into the database. So if you're looking for this in the debug pages, for example, that's going to be underneath the plugin object type. But basically, this is a super simple plugin. All we've got is a REST resource. So the class for my REST logic is here. And then that's about it. You can ignore all this other stuff because it's not being used today, but it's important that you have the REST resource you're going to define in your manifest. I've also got here an example of some capabilities and SP rights that are defined for this plugin. So I mentioned you can create custom ones or you can use out of the box. I prefer to use custom ones. And so here I've gotten two capabilities defined. One is a example plugin administrator and an example plugin reader. So one can read my get endpoints and one can interact with my post or my modification endpoints. Again, it's based on the SP right, but inside the UI, you can only assign the capabilities directly. So we've got read write, and then we've got our Java class for the plugin itself. Just going top to bottom, my imports, I'm importing a bunch of standard Java libraries to interact with Java objects, and then I've got the Java extension for web services and RESTful services. My logging, and then SailPoint objects. So the first thing to look at here is the path. The path is what you're going to specify in anytime you're addressing your created endpoints. It's going to be something like IdentityIQ/plugin/REST/ and then this path here, plugin example, and then / whatever your other endpoint, your actual endpoints are after that. We're going to import our logger, or we're going to instantiate our logger, sorry. We're going to declare a response object. Every plugin has this get plugin name. It's extending the base plugin resource, so this just overrides the method there. And then we're going to get into it with our actual methods, their action methods. The first one you can see here is just a get. We're using these notations to specify the get, specify the path. Real quick, I skipped right over it, but for the entire class here, I have a required write. And this is one of those required rights that I've included with the plugin deployment. But you can then assign this inside the UI, the capability, and you'll get access to all these methods. We'll see in a second for the post how I've overridden that to be more exclusive to just the write, SP write. So for this first example, again, I usually like to start every method or rule or anything I'm writing inside of an IdentityIQ with an entering and exiting statement, just so when I have to debug it later and I can turn on the loggers in Log4j2, that I know kind of where I'm at when those errors are getting thrown. You don't have access to a context variable by default, so the context variable is how you're going to interact with the internal APIs of SailPoint's IdentityIQ product. So you're going to want to declare a context here, and you do that simply by doing SailPoint factory.get current context. It's going to give you that context. This method, all it's doing is counting the number of identities that have a substring or are like a string that you pass into the API. So what we're doing here is we declare initialize our count to 0, and then go through a try-catch block where we're actually doing a projection query against the IdentityIQ database, doing a count, where the name of the identity is like whatever variable I pass in. So that's all it's doing, and you'll see here that I'm being careful to make sure that my responses kind of match up with those HTTP responses we talked about earlier. So I'm responding with an OK if everything succeeds and I get a count of something. Even if it's 0, it was an OK response, right? I'm going to send a 200 code back indicating to the client that that was successful. If something goes wrong in my try block, I'm going to catch the exception and I'm going to send back in this case, I'm just sending back a bad request back. But I could be a little bit more specific there, depending if I want how deep into the error handling I want to go. And then it returns the response. So it's going to return either a success or failure. So what we can do is we can actually build this, and I will import it into IdentityIQ. This is just an IdentityIQ demo tenant sitting in AWS. I'm going to log in as the admin initially. Check my password. Bet everyone knows what that password was. And I'm going to look at a couple things real quick. So if I look at an identity right now, I can go through and I can look at Adam Kennedy, for example. I can look at those capabilities, those user rights, and I can see that my example plugin administrator and my example plugin reader are sitting right here. So if I wanted to authenticate with Adam Kennedy, I'd need to make sure that he was assigned these in the UI. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm also going to show how this works. That's if you're just using basic, it's pretty simple. I would authenticate using Adam Kennedy's username and password in that authorization header. If I want to use OAuth, it's a little bit more complex, but not too bad. So global settings, API authentication, and then I'm going to say create a new client. I'm going to call this devdays4, sorry. And then I'm going to choose a proxy user. This is the user in IdentityIQ that you're going to authorize with. So just like basic, you have to make sure that user is assigned the right capability. So I'm, again, just for ease of use, I'm going to do the admin user here. Save that. It's going to give me my client ID, and if I click this, it's my client secret. And I can use that when testing in Postman. The next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually install the plugin itself. So to the plugin screen here, I'm going to delete a copy that I might have installed earlier to test. I'm going to delete that, and then I'm going to install what I have here. So that should go through. Now that's installed, the plugin's there. There's nothing about this plugin that would indicate it's been installed because it's very, very bare bones. You will see the tile show up here at the bottom. But now I can flip over to Postman. And in Postman, I've got my collection kind of set up, my get examples here. I've got a token endpoint. This is how, using those OAuth client credentials you provided, you can go ahead and fetch a token. Then you can grab this token and use it. I mean, you can set up Postman to do all this automatically for you with your collection. I was lazy. But I can go through here and I can say, paste that new token here. And then I'm going to put in, I did Adam earlier. This time I'll do Aaron. And I'll just send it over. And so this get thing is going to count 2 errands in IdentityIQ. Fairly simple, but it gives you an idea of kind of a simple GET request using a custom API. Now, if we want to get a little bit more complex, we can go through and we can do a post operation. And remembering those verbs, post is made for either creating a new object or submitting a bit more information as part of the request that you might include in that post body, that JSON body. So if we go back to IntelliJ, I've got one already created here, which is basically I'm going to post a JSON object with a couple variables in it, and then I'm going to basically spit those back out to the calling client. So in this case, I've got a request coming in. My request map contains those input variables, that JSON object, and I'm going to basically assign country, job, which are the attributes I'm going to send in, to some variables, and respond again using the OK response to print those out. You'll see here now that the required write for plugin that is the plugin administrator write operation. So if the user didn't have this, you'd get a 403 forbidden back from the API, and that's IdentityIQ doing that. So if I flip back over here real quick and show the post example, again, we can change this up. We can say, let's do Argentina, and we can say, let's send that over. Right now I'm using basic authorization, so as SP admin, and it's going to respond back, input country was Argentina. If I change this, for example, to a user that hasn't had that capability assigned to them, like Aaron Nichols, and they use Aaron Nichols' password, we should get a forbidden back. So 403, that user can't access your endpoint. So that's important when you're securing anything that you're doing. If it's very specific to an automated use case, for example, from an iPaaS solution, a integration platform as a service, that's important that non-human user is scoped down as much as possible to only have the access to access your APIs. All right. So let's see what happens if I do something crazy, like up here in this GET request. You can see the query options I was using is a simple count, right? I provide an empty query option with a filter that just matches against the name with the name that's input. Now, if I take this block of code that I have down here that says something much different, we can get rid of all of that. And what this is, it's not going to actually respond with anything. I'll just declare a response string here. And what I'll do, so what this is actually doing is now it's going to query just a blanket query option to look at every syslog event in IdentityIQ. Now, if I flip back real quick and go to debug, we can get a count of how many of those that I have in this terrible system. And I've got 213,000 syslog events. So when I submit this, once I built the plugin and imported it, let's get rid of this. I'm going to build, clean, build. Should be good. Flip back to IdentityIQ, back to the plugins. Uninstall it, reinstall it. Okay, that's back in, and now I'm going to call that GET request again. Get example. We'll do Catherine this time. I'm going to send it over. And now it's just going to hang here. When I timed this earlier, it's actually hung for like 1 minute and 50 seconds, so we might not want to wait that whole time. But basically what I've done is built a very performant, intentionally non-performant API endpoint, just to highlight the fact that you do need to make sure that you're kind of doing more than just the bare minimum, which is what I did, to actually implement that sort of filtering and all those good things to manage that performance. All right, we could sit here and watch this for the next 3 minutes, or we can conclude. Are there any questions, comments in the chat? All right. Thank you.